my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and wide.
Hi, this is Marjohn Love, and this is Marjohn's Musings. And today's show is a more serious show. Over the past 30 shows, several times I've talked to you about my concerns about losses of liberty due to reading of emails, recording of telephone calls, tapping, wiretapping. I was interested what other people were thinking about this very important topic. And I purchased a course from the Great Courses. It's called The Surveillance State, Big Data, Freedom, and You. It comes in a set of DVDs. Disc 1, Security, Liberty, or Neither. And the one on this disc that just struck me in the pit of my stomach was East Germany's Stasi state. It got me thinking about the movie Amelie. Amelie's neighbor's a curmudgeon. Amelie decides that she's going to get even with him by playing tricks on him. So she goes into his house when he's not home. I think they live in the same apartment building. And she puts in dimmer light bulbs, and she changes his slippers out for slippers that are the wrong size, and a whole bunch of other little tricks. Because the antagonist is perceived as someone unlikable, and Amelie is this little pixie, you wind up laughing at her antics. And the idea that she's trespassing and basically torturing this guy in a very gentle way, but she certainly is getting him very upset. It's not funny when it happens to you and you don't know who's doing it. And in the lesson, the East Germany Stasi state, the professor who has credentials as long as your arm, his name is Paul Rosenzweig, JD, and he's a professor lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. But he also has worked as a senior advisor for the Chertoff Group, and he served as deputy assistant secretary for policy for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's got a degree in oceanography. He's a very well-read, erudite man. If you decide to purchase the course, keep a dictionary handy, because he is a lawyer and he uses some very precise and elegant words that are not in common speech. But some of the concepts that he tries to elucidate, I found particularly chilling. One of them was failing to connect the dots on 9/11 and the U.S. spy network in action. That's all just on disc 1. Disc 2, Big Data's Shadow. Some problems with privacy. Under observation, the panopticon effect. Then one that I'm acutely aware of, drones everywhere. Then he talks about biometrics. That's using the retina of your eye or your thumbprint or your blood, your DNA, to identify you. And this disc ends on a topic that just, I had trouble sleeping. Hacking, espionage, and surveillance. Local police on the cyber beat starts disc 3. License plate readers. You know those signs that tell you how fast you're going? Surveillance cameras mounted on buildings. Geolocation, tracking you and your data. He talked a lot about cell phones, and I've brought that up as a topic in the past, but I had no idea the extent. Some of the statistics that he quotes are blood-chilling. And at a certain point in the lecture, he talks about internet surveillance. How some of these social media sites take data that you put up on like Facebook or Twitter or whatever and sell that data, and how other agencies have as many as 700 data points about you. And he challenges you to go to your computer and type in your name or someone else's name and see what pops up. And he talks about the difference between American law and regulation of surveillance and European law. It was fascinating. And then he talked about metadata. That's kind of a different, new concept for people of my generation. Like, we can understand what data is, but what is metadata? And the example he used is that every letter that was sent through the United States Post System was tracked for who sent it and who got it, where it went. Every phone call made from a certain date forward had metadata collected. And they used that data to create constellations of contact groups. So he was talking about telephone surveillance. The one that came to my mind immediately was the situation of Monica Lewinsky, who had a purported friend steal the data off her cell phone and basically ruined the girl's life. She does a TED Talk now about what it's like to be 42 and think back to when she was 22 and in love with her boss and embroiled in this horrific controversy and the impeachment of a president. And how she can't escape that because the internet retains data. The professor talks about that a bit in Technology Outruns the Law, that the laws were written at a simpler time, and that sometimes what people are doing with the data was never even conceived. And he goes back to the Constitution and search and seizure, entering, trespass into your home. And then he talks about how if you take a selfie, you're giving away your GPS data. I'm sitting there thinking you're also giving away all the possessions in the background of your shot. Not only could a thief know where you live, but also what's in your house. It was reassuring in the sense that Sometimes my husband thinks I'm a little paranoid. I used to work mental health back in the day. And at the nurses' station, one of the sassy, feisty nurses with a good sense of humor had put up this Kilroy was here with Kilroy's nose and fingers peeking over the brick wall. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. It took me quite a few years to realize that for people who suffer from chronic anxiety and fear of persecution and overexposure, that poster was a bit sadistic. We thought it was funny, but I don't think some of the patients thought it was funny. In Disc 4, he talked about the Internet of Things. The one that chilled me was this picture of this beautiful little baby on a baby monitor being broadcast over the internet. There is a thriving world business in kidnapped children, little children. Some people just want to adopt, but some are used as sex slaves. Some are used as labor slaves. We saw that in Haiti after the earthquake. The idea that you would publish to an insecure, easily surveyed by you don't know who site intimate photos of your baby gave me pause. Not like a still shot, but hi, here's the GPS location of my infant sleeping, and for whatever reason, I'm not there with my infant. I was like, wow. The one I was looking forward to was the class number 20, Anonymity, Going Off the Grid. But instead of giving helpful advice, if you kind of wanted to become somewhat anonymous, to be left in peace, just to be left secure and solitary, which is different than lonely, but just to be in peace alone, not being interfered with or watched or tracked or listened to, analyzed. And instead he talked about Whitey Bulger. I was like, oh, okay. One of the interesting ones he did was code breaking versus code making. I was at the Second Glance, and I found 2 of my books for sale for $2. Does that mean I'm becoming an anachronism in my own time? This book, The Artist's Way, was written by Julia Cameron, and it was very influential in my life. It was copyrighted in 1992. So if you do the math on that, that's, wow, longer ago than I would have thought. Anyway, this book was very instrumental in me going ahead with my writing and taking my own writing seriously. But the professor was talking about a new type of computer that had a qubit. The current computers are either on or off. And they come in 2-bit pairs, so this one can be off and this one can be on, or they can both be off or they can both be on. And he was talking about how qubits come in 3s, and they can be on, all 3 of them, or off, all 3 of them, or in some indeterminate state. I wondered how you'd control that. I mentioned to you on the show about silk that the old jacquard looms had punch cards that lifted needles so that threads were popped up and down to weave intricate patterns, and that binomial system became the foundation for modern computer math. And there was this book that I've had for years, the Illustrated I Ching, and in it are the different trigrams. And when you put two trigrams together, you get a hexagram. And it must have been something that people used in computer programming, because my father used to talk about programming in hexadecimal. In the I Ching, you either have a solid line or a broken line. One was considered masculine and the other one feminine. One strong, one weak. And yet the weak force, water, dissolves everything. If you don't believe me, Google whack the Grand Canyon. But it was kind of interesting to see my book there at the second glance. When I did the silk show, I showed you this scarf, all crispy. I wanted you to see the flow of the fabric and how lovely it drapes once you take the dye out. And since I told you I'm a beginner at silk, this is something new for me, I decided I would also get a video on how to do more complex shibori. So this shibori video is about a Japanese village and their 400th anniversary of Japanese artisans making beautiful cloth for kimonos. And the young lady that narrates it is very much proud of her culture and proud of the artisans she's interviewing. But some of the things I found kind of interesting were I had seen sarongs and head cloths from Africa, and they have very distinctive patterning and colors. And it was kind of funny for me to find out that they were imported to Africa from this village in Japan, who's been making these fabrics for 400 years. One of the techniques that they showed involved this lady sitting on the floor on a tatami and a cushion with a hook. And the hook was in a bamboo pole. And she would take the fabric and hook it on the hook and then tie around the point of the hook and move the fabric and go another dot over. And by that means, they made extensive patterns, and the size of the hook and the number of wraps of the thread defined how the little dot or pucker came out when the fabric was dyed. The one that I've been doing at home involves folding. You fold the fabric and fold the fabric. And depending on how you fold it or crunch it and where you apply the dye, you get different patterns. So I showed you this knit silk from the John Tar shop. And here it is, shiboried. In a very simple shibori. I realized watching the shibori video that they have amazingly intricate techniques that involve sewing and wrapping and tying and folding and squashing and compressing. And it was kind of strange for me, though, being a modern American, looking at their production facility, that they used a great deal of water. And having recently purchased some of the chemicals for dyeing in a vat rather than painting, I was acutely aware that some of those chemicals are not ingestible. And I had run out of the dye set that I recommended to you in the demo silk show about how you could make your own silk scarves at home. So instead of getting another small bottle, I got a larger bottle. And because the label was larger, I was able to read, "Warning, this product contains a chemical known to the state of California to cause cancer." Well, that stopped me dead in my tracks. I live a couple of blocks off the beach in Rockport. If I dump this down the drain, what sea life am I affecting? And that's one of my scratch your head and worry about. I worry about the state of the ocean, the health of the sea creatures. The fact that when I talk to fishermen in Gloucester, sitting having a beer at one of the local bars or whatever, and they say, they went out and they came back empty. And that's with satellite imagery and GPS location. They can't find fish to fill the boats. And here I am thinking that I'm making something of beauty, and perhaps I'm adding to the poisoning of the planet. It really disturbed me. So I thought, well, you have to set the dye. Otherwise, it bleeds all over you. So if you want colored clothes, you have to set the dye. So I decided I would experiment with how could I use less of that and perhaps be more eco-friendly, because all the dyes I use are non-toxic. And I did an internet search and I found out that some people who were concerned about this issue use a spray bottle. So I did the math, took the calculator out, and I figured out that if I mixed 1 to 2 teaspoons of the concentrate to 20 ounces of the water, which is about here in the bottle, saturate the cloth and wait 10 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes for red and purple, 10 minutes for most other colors. Then you rinse it thoroughly in warm water and cool water until the water runs clear. Then you wash it in warm water. And then for the last rinse, so that it gets that soft, supple feel, I dunk them in Downy fabric softener that's diluted. And then the type of dye I'm using can be set with an iron as well. So I iron the damp scarves dry. And then I got to thinking, if I'm spraying with this sprayer, and anybody who's used Windex, you smell the ammonia in the Windex. It becomes vaporized in the air. Well, if there's a cancer-causing chemical in that mix, you don't want to be breathing that. And so there's a way you can protect yourself. These are not cheap. This is a 3M paint spray respirator, low maintenance, and it comes with pads that are interchangeable. And I advise you, if you decide to do this method, that you wear a respirator and spray outside or with really good ventilation inside. It was kind of strange. Kevin's been away. My husband is a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves, which means he gets activated to go here, there, and everywhere every once in a while. So I've been on my own now for well over a week, and it'll be close to 2 weeks by the time I get him back. And he was down in Texas, and I was worried about him being activated to go deal with the disaster down in Houston. 14 inches of rain in 4 hours, 19 inches over a total of how many days? People being washed away. And our minister at our church reassured me that it wasn't all that easy to activate a reservist, and if he had a set assignment, he'd probably stay on that and come home. But they did activate the National Guard. But back to my course about Paul Rosenweiss. His 4th disc, where he's talking about the code breaking versus the code making. He talked about prime numbers and how prime numbers, the multiplying of prime numbers, can give you security codes, and how the federal government demanded these security codes from email servers that were supposed to be secure, so that you could send an email as a private letter. Just like in the old days, you wrote one out by hand, stuck it in an envelope, licked the glue on the envelope, or used a sponge, and stuck a stamp on it, and that document was then secure. Because if anybody other than the intended recipient opened that, or their legal guardian, okay? So the intended recipient or their legal guardian, if anybody other than that opened that communication, it was a federal crime. He talked about in class number 22, Europe's right to be forgotten. I think anybody who's dealt with the legal system has dealt with the idea of statute of limitations. That means if you've committed a crime and you have not been prosecuted over a certain period of time, they can't come get you 20 or 30 years later and prosecute you for a misdemeanor. Now, murder 1, there is no statute of limitations. You kill somebody, it doesn't matter where you run, where you hide, they can and do come get you. But what if you're like me and you opened a business and it's not doing very well? I have no net earnings to report. I've been in business 2 years. If I had taken a loan to open the business rather than using my savings, I might be put in a position of bankruptcy. And his example was about a man who lost his home. And how long would that information trail that man? I shared with you on a prior show that I have an acquaintance who, when she was young and a bit foolish and angry with her mother, did a spread for, I don't remember whether it was Playboy or Penthouse, but it was one of these girly magazines which are tame by today's standards, but at the time they were considered highly risque. You know, some girl topless in a G-string. And there was a huge brouhaha about it. And she lived it down and moved and dropped off what at that time was a very modest grid. And then 20 years later, married with a child, someone took their old girly magazines and posted them on the internet. Word got back to her husband. There was all sorts of marital discord because she had kept this episode of her life secret. It was sort of like listening to Monica talking about how she was labeled a whore because she had an affair with her boss. I hate to tell you how many young women have affairs with their boss. I don't know that it always goes the other way around. I don't know how many young men have affairs with their older female boss. But I'm sure it happens. The idea that everywhere you go, if you take out your ATM card and you buy a cup of coffee, and later on you go to lunch, or you go out to the mall and you pick up a new outfit for Marjohn's Musings so that you look pretty on the set, that they're tracking your every purchase everywhere you go and building a dossier about you, about where you are shopping and how much you spend and what you buy. The professor gave a interesting piece about how Target figured out that they could fairly accurately diagnose pregnancy by what women purchased in the store. I found that a bit distressing. And then he was talking about, medical records. And also, with the Internet of Things, there are now pacemakers that you can pick up your telephone and your nurse can electronically adjust your pacemaker from a distance. And that when George W. Bush was hospitalized, his vice president had a pacemaker and for security reasons had to turn it off for several days until George got back out of the hospital and could resume control. The idea that malicious actors could access people's CPAP machines. I did a show where I talked about that I have to wear a CPAP. I have thyroid disease, I have diabetes, and I've become very heavy as a result of that, even though I try to eat carefully and weigh and measure my food. And when I first got my CPAP machine, I was supposed to mail these chips back and forth to the healthcare provider so that they could track every breath I take, like the old Sting song. I was like, excuse me, no. That's such an invasion of my privacy. I can't even describe how distressed I get about it. You do not have the right to watch every breath I take. Who are you that you have the right to invade my bedroom? So the professor talks about national security and the First Amendment. I've been having problems at my house. I got a little pop-up window on my computer where I do my editing. I have an airport time capsule. It's 3 terabytes, heck of a lot of data. I could put a whole lot of TV shows on it. And I thought it was worth it to me to spend the $300 plus shipping plus tax to buy this drive to store my data rather than put it on the cloud, which I don't like and I don't trust. I feel it's vulnerable to hacking. And to prove the point that just because you're paranoid, doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. I got a letter, purportedly from the Internal Revenue Service, that my Social Security number and identity had been hacked. It wasn't just me. Tens of thousands of people, and the professor talks about it. The thing I found distressing is they were offering me a free 1-year plan with a company that was going to secure my identity. Well, if it's already been stolen, how are you going to secure it? I'm 63. I'm not moving. Well, I mean, if I blow a stroke, I'll go to a nursing home if I live through it. But other than that, I live in Rockport and I intend to stay here. This is my home. This is where I live. I'm not going to change my name. I'm not going to use a pseudonym. He talks about, WikiLeaks and Snowden and folks like that, divulging some of the vast scope of this surveillance. There's a creepy science fiction series called Fringe with exploding heads and blood splattered on the wall kind of stuff. And like ooey gooey, implanted parasites that grow huge and all sorts of, ugly horror science fiction mix. But in it were some startling scenes of Agent Dunham, lovely young blonde woman, very bright, working for the FBI, lying in bed and having someone from outside her home turn on her computer that she had turned off. So I get up in the morning last week, turn my computer on. Your airport time capsule is going to be erased. I unplugged the computer. I had stuff I had to do. I came back 2.5 hours on the phone with Apple Care. And several of the people were shocked that I got that message and they were going to help me and they did all these things. And then, 2 days later, just for ho-hos, I checked my computer backup, the backup drive. It had been erased. Why would I purchase a backup drive if someone other than me has access and can erase it? So the professor ends the course, chapter 24. The privacy debate needs you. He talked about how sometimes the people who bring things to public attention about the loss of privacy do so at the risk of their own anonymity. If you stand up to be counted and say, I am an American, I have the right to freedom of speech, I have the right to freedom of association, I have the right to maintain personal private documents. I have the right to freedom of religion. I have the right to freedom of thought. I have the right to put those thoughts down and have those documents in my possession remain secure. I wasn't sure how to bring these problems and issues to your attention. They really worried me. This isn't a small thing that's only happening to an isolated few people. And it will continue to happen unless we rise up and say, we're not tolerating this. 1984 was a cautionary book. It was not a prescription for business as usual. So in the past, I've read you the Daily Word. And sometimes I just open it, not to a specific date, and I read the message. So I just happened on April 20th. I listen as Spirit calls me to become all that I can be. Takes courage. You know, we just had Earth Day. The minister at our church painted a rather dismal, distressing picture of what humans had done to the planet. Sometimes maliciously, but sometimes out of ignorance. I washed an entire bottle of this. Now, it was a small bottle, but I washed an entire bottle of this down my drain. 1 and 2 ounces at a time. And any of you who followed the show know how adamant I am about not polluting the water. I mean, sometimes we do things through malfeasance, but sometimes we do things out of stupidity or ignorance or carelessness or just not perceiving the effect of our actions. Good stewards, I bless the earth through my loving thoughts and actions. You know, and if NSA, you know, there's this catalog I get. It's called the Northern Sun. I've talked to you about it before. I got my very first show. I'm wearing a t-shirt out of here. He has one in here. The NSA, the government agency that actually listens to you. I was like, ooh, it's a bestseller. That makes me think that I'm not the only one worried about this. So, if someone bombs the World Trade Center and frightens the Congress into passing the Patriot Act, which gives broad, sweeping power to law enforcement and security, is there any way that we, as citizens of the United States, or for those of you watching this show in other countries, because Marjohn's Musings is on the World Wide Web, is there any way that we can stop the Stasi state where you can't even make love in private? You can't have an argument with your spouse in private. You can't bitch and moan to your mother about how nasty your boss is in private. Saturday, April 23rd. With God, all things are possible. I think if enough people petitioned Congress to be able to have small, simple computers, that they could have a little laptop that did not go on the internet, so that they could use a word processing program in the privacy of their home, at least for writers. That would give us a sense of humanity, which has been raped and pillaged by people uploading documents off our personal computers and putting them on Verizon Drive or the Windows version of the iCloud or Apple's iCloud. I don't know what these mass storage facilities are called in other countries or other manufacturers, but I'm sure those aren't the only ones. I got these magazines. They're called The Sun. Into the Fire. The Sun celebrates personal writing. And they host gatherings. I think I'm going to take myself to one for my birthday. I was looking at this one, and I got hooked on an article of all things about snakes. I was bitten by a water moccasin and damn near died. I don't like snakes. But the guy was such a compelling writer. His name is Edward Abbey, and the article is Serpents of Paradise. The April mornings are bright and clear and calm. Not until the afternoon does the wind begin to blow, raising dust and sand in funnel-shaped twisters that spin across the desert briefly, like dancers, then collapse. Whirlwinds from which issue no voice or word, except the forlorn moan of the elements under stress. After reconnoitering dust devils come the real, serious wind, the voice of the desert rising to a demented howl and blotting out the sky, and sun behind yellow clouds of dust, sand, confusion, embattled birds, last year's scrub oak leaves, pollen, the husks of locusts, bark of juniper, time of the red eye, the sore and bloody nostril, the sand-pitted windshield, if one is foolish enough to drive his car into such a storm. Time to sit indoors and continue that letter which is never finished, while the fine dust forms neat little windrows under the edge of the door and on the window sills. I was like captivated. Edward Abbey, Serpents of Paradise. The Sun, April 2016. I asked one of the doctors that I visit through their secretary to send me a copy of my medical record, because they were going to send these records to another physician. 49 pages. A lot of it completely redundant. Some of it absolutely false. some of it divulging information that I shared with Rose Osborne before she died. She's been dead over a decade. That information is in this packet to go out to a new person. I never would have told the person I asked these records for. I'm there going, and the professor said one of the most vulnerable areas of your personal information is your medical record. He was talking about how we should have the right to review records and correct mistakes. And he talked about how certain records on the internet now carry this little box in Europe. Some information has been deleted. But even if they do that, if you have to have this box saying information is deleted, then that sort of casts a suspicion upon you. Like, what did you delete and why? He was talking about the dark web, where criminal activity happens. Some of that is so bizarre that I don't even want to talk about it. The surveillance state and you. I wish Teddy Kennedy was still alive. I'd make an appointment and go down and talk to him. Say, hey, Ted, can you protect us from the surveillance state? I can't do it alone, folks. If you want to maintain your privacy and your civil liberties, you've got to take action. And who you vote for matters. Do vote. I wish I could leave you with some upbeat little ditty. It's not a simple problem. We'll talk about it again. But for today, that's all for now. This is Marjohn Love, my real name. Because if I can't be who I am, who am I supposed to be? Who are you? Do you want to be able to stand up and be who you are? And if you're American, are you still free? Marjohn's Musings.